Hey YouTube, this is Jimmy. A couple of months ago, I built a couple computer desks for my computer room. My wife and I needed our own computers now since I retired. We're both fighting over the same one. So I wanted to make a couple of kind of matching, maybe like a book match type deal where they're kind of mirror images of each other because they're going to be next to each other in a room. And I had some big mesquite slabs that a friend of mine gave me, and one of them was kind of perfect for this. So I'm going to show how I made this. Not so much the techniques and stuff, because there's actually a lot better videos out there to show how to do these kind of tops. This is a pretty defective mesquite slab on each side that I filled with epoxy. So it's really, your typical epoxy pour. And I'm going to put a link into Blacktail Studios. The guy that runs that site is Cam and does all the work. And he's got some excellent information on how to do epoxy river tabletops. What I'm going to more focus on is just, I haven't seen a lot of these done for computer desks. So I put a keyboard tray in there that's also the matching wood, and I use a sit stand desk seats. And I wanted to point out not so much how to do this, but a few things that I did wrong that I wanted to warn people about and have them think about before they do something like this. So maybe they'll have be able to avoid those mistakes that I made. So this page here is the right table, and then I'll show you the other one. It's kind of a match. They're both about 21, 22 inches deep and about 44 inches wide or so, which isn't terribly big. I would have liked them to be another 6 inches wider, probably, especially on this desktop that's showing, because I'm using a large monitor on this one. However, the slabs are what they are, and I had to work within the constraints of the size. And to be honest, they're big enough because the computer desk that they're replacing is actually a little bit smaller than this, so I know I could get by with using it. And then you'll see that I have the monitors lifted up on a pole mount instead of using their stands, and this helps a lot too because it gets the monitor towards the back and gets it off the table. So even though they're not super big tops, most of the surface area is usable for papers and keyboards and things like that. So it actually is working out well, this size. And this is the matching one for the left side of the room. It has a 30-inch monitor on it, which you can see proportionally looks better, I think. It's since it's smaller than the top versus the 39-inch monitor I have on the other desk. But this is the size of monitor my wife wanted, so that's what she gets. And here are the final two desks in their use positions in my computer room. The slide out keyboard tray. You can see the desk will rise to pre-programmed positions like any sit-stand desk will. I used undermount drawer slides to hold the keyboard tray up. So I machined these pockets out and the groove for the slide with the CNC. Normally these would go inside a drawer box, kind of inside the box sides, but in this case this is a solid slab of mesquite that's about 1.25 inches thick. So I just machined the whole pocket and everything inside into that. So you can see, then it slides right in underneath like that. These use a clamp on monitor stand. It's basically just a really heavy duty pole that clamps on the back. They're pretty adjustable. You can move the monitor back and forth here pretty easily, which works nice, and they'll handle monitors up to about 50 pounds or so, so that works well. So the slab I was starting with was approximately 6 inches thick. you want to have quite a bit of extra when doing these slabs because there's definitely going to be some warpage when you cut these two in half. So in this case, I'm taking a chainsaw and cutting it in half, so there's going to be even more waste because a chainsaw leaves a pretty wide cut. I could have taken it to a place that had a bandsaw mill. I don't have one, but that would have made it a flatter, thinner curve for sure. But with 6 inches to spare, I felt like I had enough. So in this case, I basically just kind of worked around the edge with the chainsaw, trying to cut this, in half. And that's not too hard to do as long as you got, 3/4 of an inch of extra margin to work with, because that's about as good as you're going to do with a chainsaw across this big of a surface. I stood it up with some wood clamps on edge, sitting on some 2x4s in my driveway, and just kind of worked around it. And worked around it all the way to the other side. So you kind of just really try to keep your saw straight. I have a 20-inch bar on this saw, so it's pretty easy to get off in the inner depths of the piece. So I always start out by scoring all the way around the piece to keep my center line of the slab, and then be very careful to keep the cut going vertically down. And I usually cut halfway through at least from the top as well, and really pay attention to the angle of my saw as I'm cutting. So this is the two halves being opened up after I just cut it open. You can see a lot of defects in this piece. In fact, it's barely hanging together on the one end of the log. And when you take all the bark occlusions out and everything, there's basically a gap that runs about 95% of the length of this. So I have to be really careful not to break it at this stage. And in a different video, I showed how the Avid CNC is really good for putting spline joints on things like this. I actually had to tie the end closest to me in this picture together with a large spline joint on the end to keep it together, so that it didn't fall apart before I got the epoxy in, and as well as the epoxy itself isn't really strong enough to trust that won't crack off later as well. So now it goes to the CNC machine, where I'll use that as a planer. You see many people on YouTube doing that. I have an Avid CNC 4x4 machine. Works very well with these slabs. I basically set them on top and use door jamb shims to kind of level it off for the first pass on the top to get that flat. The shims hold it from like wobbling around, and then I can flip it over and cut it flat. So I'm not going to show that. There's plenty of examples on YouTube, but everybody pretty much does that the same. Here's a picture of the spline joints as they're being glued. So you can see it's just a long slot that I cut into the end grain with the CNC, and made a nice fitting piece of mesquite to slide in there. They're probably 2.5 inches deep and about 7 or 8 inches long at least. I have another video that I'll put in the description on actually how I put those slots in. Okay, this is the first stage in preparation of the top for pouring epoxy. So I got myself a piece of melamine particle board, which is sitting between my router tabletop here and the slab. And then I got some just cheap caulk, doesn't really matter what kind, any kind will do, and applied it around the areas where the epoxy would be coming through the bottom. And this is just to keep the epoxy from running out between the bottom of the slab and the melamine, because I'm not going to put a full form all the way around this. I'm trying to minimize the amount of epoxy I use because it's very expensive. So I'm essentially sealing the areas around where the epoxy is to the melamine, and then I'm going to do the same thing on the sides so that we don't need side forms for this to hold the messy epoxy in. It's a good idea to put some sacrificial spacers in between the cauls and the top so that when you fill up the areas with epoxy, it doesn't glue the top and the cauls together. Otherwise, you'll have a very hard time getting the cauls off. I ended up having to cut my first ones off with a flush cutting saw. So these little pieces of 1/8 inch plywood make great spacers, and if they get glued down, it's no big deal because you'll just machine them off with the CNC later when you're resurfacing and flattening the whole thing. Okay, this is the top with everything clamped down on top of the melamine, so the bottom voids are sealed down to the melamine, the cauls are clamped down, so everything's flat and held down in place, and the bottom is sealed. Now we just need to create some perimeter seals so that the epoxy is held in on the sides as well as the bottom. All right, this is the first side that has some big exit cracks where the epoxy would just run out. So here I'm taking a little sliver of or strip of melamine coated MDF. This might actually be greaseboard material, but it's got a good slippery surface, so the epoxy doesn't stick to it very well. I again used caulk around the perimeter. You want to be careful that you don't get caulk into the void, otherwise you'll end up with pits or voids in the epoxy, and you don't really want that on the side. You want it to be nice and filled in. So use the caulk sparingly and keep it away from the edges so it doesn't ooze into the area where you want the epoxy. Then you just clamp it in place like this until it dries, and you can remove the clamps because the caulk holds it pretty well. Now here's the end grain cracks being covered up with a piece of melamine as well, just glued on across the end. The other thing to point out here is that this epoxy is very thin, very fluid like water. It'll level itself out on this table. So if you're doing this work in a garage or something where the floor isn't level, you're going to need to level whatever your setup you're sitting on. In my case, I'm sitting on a router table, but my garage has a 1/4 inch per foot slope in it, like most garages do. So I actually had to shim up one end of my router table almost a full inch to get this nice and level. And you really want to do that, because if you forget, you're going to notice that when you get your pour about halfway full and realize that you're not going to actually be able to pour this flat across the top, because it's going to be much deeper on one side than the other. And that's kind of a pain to do in the middle of a pour. So try and remember to get this all nice and leveled before you start pouring epoxy. Here's the first half of the pour for this slab. You can see I've left about a 1/2 inch in depth here. This is black, so I mixed a black coloring in with the clear epoxy. And here's where I wanted to point out one of my big mistakes. As you'll see on Blacktail Studios website or YouTube site, you're really not supposed to use regular. There's kind of two kinds of epoxies. There's what I call like a surface finish or coating epoxy, and a deep pour epoxy. The surface type is kind of for countertops like bar top, thin layers where they can cool, they don't get too thick and they cool easily, versus deep pour where you're pouring like a 1/2 inch or deeper. The problem is epoxy is an exothermic reaction when it cures, which means it gives off heat, and as it gives off heat, it cures faster, and as it cures faster, it gives off more heat. It's a thermal runaway process. And so every 10 degrees increase in 10 degrees Celsius increase doubles the speed of the chemical reaction. So in places like where I live in Phoenix, Arizona, in the summertime, you have to be extremely careful with this. I got up at 5 in the morning to pour this and had fans blowing on it and everything, and it still got so hot that it was smoking and bubbling, which obviously does not leave a good looking finish. Unfortunately, this was a black finish, so after I milled it off, I had little air bubbles. I could refill them with more epoxy and cover it up. But that's the last thing you want. If it's a semi-transparent or fully transparent, it's just going to look horrible. So the deep pour stuff is specifically made for this type of situation where you have really deep fills like this. It cures much slower. It's formulated to have a very slow cure and stay cooler longer. Now it takes longer to cure, and some of them don't ever get as hard as the other kind. That's kind of the trade-offs. I'll also put a link in the comments section, in the description section, for all of these resources. But there is a guy that did an excellent review of a whole bunch of different epoxies. He did a really good job and really covered a lot of different areas of you know concerns like UV protection, hardness, strength, yellowness, clarity, lack of bubbles, all of that stuff. It was just an excellent thing. I'll put a link in there. So, but again, this is not the appropriate type of epoxy, and I kind of paid the price for that. But lesson learned. And so here's the final depth of the pour up to the top, and here is a perfect example of why I should have used deep pour epoxy. You can see all these bubbles on the surface. This is the actual final finish hardened epoxy, and it's got all these bubbles in it now. Again, fortunately, these are on top. I'm going to machine off all of them, fill them with more epoxy, so I could recover in this case because it's a very dark black color. But this would have essentially ruined the table if you were trying to make one of the opaque or clear colored pours. So again, very fortunate for me that this was black. So now this would basically go back to the CNC machine. I milled off the epoxy and the wood to the final thicknesses. The other thing to remember with this is you really want to have the wood dried properly and stable, because the epoxy and the wood do not expand and contract at different or at the same rates. And so if you're going to bring this into a more humid environment in the house, like in Arizona, it's actually sometimes too dry outside if the wood's been a long time in, say, May or April. So if your house environment is going to be 30 or 40% humidity, you might want to think about conditioning it towards that. It's always wise with woodworking, but with these tabletops, I've done a few of them, and you can definitely see in the surface and the reflection that over time the wood and epoxy don't stay perfectly flat with each other, and conditioning the wood is a key for that. So kind of pay attention to your shop environment, where your wood is stabilized to and where you're intending to go there. Also, in case anybody's interested, I do almost all of my projects, finish it with Minwax polyurethane. I just have been using that probably for the last 20 years. I really like it. I use satin instead of semi-gloss most of the time, and I almost never use full gloss because I just don't like the looks of it, and every little defect shows. But I don't like the way the wood grain comes through in the reflections of the gloss. So I use satin typically, and satin is a little easier to work with. It dries a little faster and doesn't have that skin on it that's hard to sand when it's still curing. So on a tabletop like this that I want to be extra tough, I'll typically wipe on 3 or 4 coats with the wipe on finish, and then I'll spray another 3 or 4 with the aerosol cans, and that just comes out to be a really nice even finish that's very durable. I'll let it cure for 1 or 2 weeks before I set anything on it and stuff. But that's a very nice, durable finish, and it's repairable. You can always sand it down and put another coat on later. And then I'll always sand. Usually the first few coats I'll be sanding with like a 400 grit in between coats, and then on the final few coats I'll probably switch to 600 most of the time, just to kind of knock off some of the bumps. And it's a nice easy finish in the garage. I don't have to worry about dust. I don't have a special spray booth or anything like that. But if you do it in your garage with the aerosol, back the cars out of your garage, because man, that overspray will drift across even a very large garage like mine and leave a kind of a rough surface on, and your spouse probably won't like it when you get it on their car. As I mentioned briefly before, when you're buying your kits for the legs, spend some time looking at the weight they can lift, as well as what the max and min sizes that they'll support are. These all, most of the ones I've used have a kind of an expandable width. They'll have a couple of tubes where they're adjustable from some minimum to some maximum length or of the table, and then the cross members from the front to the back of the table in this case are not adjustable typically. So in my case, I bought such a big table that they would have stuck out towards the user and out the back. I actually had to cut them off with a cutoff wheel and refinish and repaint those, because like I said before, this was really an overkill set of legs for the size of this tabletop. You can buy some that are probably $130 to $150 that are very good quality. There's a lot of choices on Amazon for this stuff, but pay attention to the sizes. They all have, the ones that are, if you spend $150, you're generally going to get a pretty good set of legs here. They have typically a motor on each leg, and they're synchronized, and then most of them have the touchpad with where the user can program several different heights into it, plus then a continuously adjustable up and down button as well. But they work really nice, and then you can buy all kinds of different accessories to bolt on underneath this. And since that's a 2-inch slab, you can use leg screws to screw something up. They make nice racks where you can hang a full desktop computer from the top. I screwed my keyboard mounts up into that. In this case, it's a couple of pieces of Mesquite where the drawer slides mounted to, and then in the back I have kind of a cable management rack that I also screwed in there. So there's all kinds of accessories on Amazon and other places for things you can screw on underneath to make, kind of configure this however you want. So it's a very flexible project. I was happy how they turned out, and I didn't spend a lot of money other than the legs. The hardware was the most expensive part, since I got the tops for free. But these are nice. You can go down to the wood store or get a chainsaw and make your own slab, and be creative and kind of come up with a lot of different options here for a computer desk. If you like this kind of video, let me know. If you have any questions, let me know. I always answer all the questions and responses in the comments section. So, and if you like it a lot, please subscribe. That helps me out. So, thank you. Have a good day.